The last train had always felt like a haven after long shifts, a quiet stretch of time when I could finally unwind, even if just for the brief journey home. But that night, something felt off. The kind of off that settles under your skin, nagging at your instincts. I waited on the deserted platform, pulling my coat tighter as a cool breeze swept through, rattling the leaves around me. It wasn't particularly cold, but I couldn't shake the chill creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just fatigue. The night was unusually silent, the city noise seeming distant, muffled somehow. The train arrived with a screech, lights flickering as it pulled up, nearly blinding me in the empty station. I stepped on, expecting to see the usual handful of other tired souls, but it was empty, not a single passenger in sight. I shrugged it off, choosing a seat in the middle where the faint hum of the overhead lights provided some comfort. As the train jolted forward, I felt it again, that eerie sensation of something being just wrong. I let my gaze wander across the car, searching for a distraction, and that's when I saw him. At the other end of the car, half hidden in the dim light, sat a man. His posture was unnaturally still, his face concealed by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, the kind you don't see much these days. He wore a long, dark coat that seemed to melt into the shadows. I could barely make out his hands, clasped tightly in his lap. I tried to look away, to shake off the unease, but my eyes kept drifting back. He hadn't moved an inch. I found myself staring, waiting for any sign of life, a shift in his posture, a turn of the head, anything to reassure me he was just another late commuter. But he remained frozen, as though he were part of the train itself, an immovable shadow in the corner of my vision. The minutes dragged by, each one stretching longer than the last. I tried to keep my eyes on my own reflection in the window, but every time I glanced back, he was still there, unmoved, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't help it. I started to feel like he was watching me, too. Then, without warning, the train lurched to a grinding halt. We were somewhere between stations, buried in the pitch-black tunnels beneath the city. The lights flickered, dimming just enough to deepen the shadows around us. The man hadn't moved. He sat, unbothered, while my heart hammered against my chest. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just tired, but the silence felt heavy, as if the whole train were holding its breath. When I glanced back toward him again, my blood went cold. He was gone. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing, just an empty seat where the man had been sitting. I looked around, searching for any sign of him, telling myself he must have slipped into another car. But I hadn't heard the door open. The car felt like it was closing in around me, pressing on my lungs. I stood up, moving cautiously to the next car, hoping to see him there, hoping to rationalize what I'd just seen. But the next car was empty. I moved to the next, and the next, all of them deserted. By now I was close to panic. Every empty car felt like it was mocking me, as if I were the only one on the train. Or maybe something was waiting for me, biding its time. My mind was racing. Every shadow in every corner seemed to move, dancing just out of my line of sight. The train felt suffocating, every inch of it pressing against me in that unbearable silence. Finally, the train jolted back into motion. I stumbled slightly, clutching the pole beside me, trying to calm my nerves, trying to breathe. The train started moving faster than usual, speeding through the darkened tunnels at an unnatural pace. Each moment felt warped, every sound amplified, every flicker of light casting eerie, shifting shadows along the empty seats. I counted the minutes, begging silently for the station to come into view, for the feeling of safety that the platform would bring. And then, at last, the train began to slow down, the station lights appearing in the distance like a beacon. When the doors slid open, I didn't hesitate. I bolted, practically leaping onto the platform, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. But I couldn't resist one last look back. The train sat there, doors open, silent, the interior empty. Or so I thought. Just as the doors were about to close, I caught a glimpse, just a flicker, in the last car, near the back. It was him, the man with the wide-brimmed hat, standing in the shadows perfectly still, staring at me. His face was hidden in darkness, but I felt his gaze bore into me, as if he were studying me, memorizing me. And then the train pulled away, carrying him into the dark. I watched, frozen, until it disappeared around the bend, the eerie silence settling around me once more. I haven't seen him since, but some nights when I find myself alone, I feel that same creeping unease, that cold prickle at the back of my neck. And I swear, sometimes just as I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear the faint sound of a train rolling down the darkened track, its lights flickering, and in that fleeting moment, I know he's still out there, somewhere, waiting. It was my last shift, 30 years of working the graveyard shift in the subway tunnels, and I thought I'd seen everything. Tonight felt different, though. Maybe it was the sense of finality, or maybe it was Ben's nervous energy. He was fresh on the job, barely 25, wide-eyed but still green. Must be the stories, he'd joked earlier, his voice trembling as he tried to laugh it off. I'd chuckled along, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. We were doing a final inspection of the tunnel, a routine check, my last one. The only sounds were our footsteps, echoing in the long, empty corridor, and the faint hum of the city above. As we rounded a bend, the air changed. A cold gust hit us, unexpected and sharp, and I felt it, an unnatural chill that bit through my jacket. Then came the low, guttural growl. I stopped, my boots scraping against the concrete. Ben froze, eyes wide, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, barely audible. The sound was strange, like an animal, but not quite right. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him it was probably just some stray dog. But then the growl came again, closer this time. And it wasn't the growl of any animal I knew. There was an intelligence behind it, something that chilled me to my core. Our flashlights flickered. I shook mine, hoping it was just a loose battery. But as the lights wavered, I could see something lurking just beyond the beams. Two eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, staring at us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. They blinked, and in that instant, I knew this wasn't some animal. Whatever it was watching us, waiting. "Run," I whispered to Ben. He looked at me, terrified, but he didn't need to be told twice. We took off, our footsteps echoing in the tunnel as we sprinted down the dark corridor, the yellow eyes following us unblinking. The growling grew louder, turning into a heavy, rhythmic breathing that was too close, far too close. I could feel it behind us, feel its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. My heart pounded as we ran, every step feeling like a mile. The tunnel felt endless, stretching on into darkness, and I could feel my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. But the fear, that primal, bone-deep terror, drove me forward. I glanced back once, just for a second, and I saw it. A shadow, massive and hunched, with those awful yellow eyes fixed on us, hungry, unrelenting. The creature didn't make any sound other than that terrible breathing, like it was savoring the chase. I could feel its gaze boring into my back, feel the weight of its anticipation. I knew somehow that it wanted us to run, wanted us to feel the fear, to taste the panic. Ahead, a faint glow. The station was close. Salvation. or at least the illusion of it. I pushed myself harder, my body screaming in protest, but I didn't care. We burst onto the platform, stumbling, gasping for breath, and collapsed in a heap. The silence was deafening. The station was empty, the rows of benches stretching out into the shadows, but I didn't care. All I cared about was that we had made it. I turned to Ben, saw the terror etched on his face, and realized that he'd seen it too. Whatever that thing was, we'd both seen it. Both felt its presence. We sat there for a long time in that empty station, too scared to move, too scared to look back into the tunnel. Finally, Ben spoke, his voice barely a whisper. What was that? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that it was real, and that it was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting. We never saw the creature again, but that night stayed with us. A memory burned into our minds, and every time I close my eyes, I can still see them, those yellow eyes, watching from the shadows, waiting. I thought it would be fun. Just a little adventure, a harmless dare. The guys and I, a bunch of college friends always up for urban exploration, couldn't resist the challenge. We'd heard the stories about the abandoned subway station, buried somewhere beneath the city, locked up decades ago, lost to the world. The place was infamous around here, a magnet for urban legends and ghost stories, the perfect place to test our nerves. The guys were psyched about it, and honestly, so was I. It took us a while to find the entrance, hidden away in a crumbling old alleyway, boarded up and marked with "Do Not Enter" signs. That didn't stop us. With some prying and a bit of brute force, we managed to pull open the boards, revealing a narrow, pitch-black stairway. Flashlights on, we took our first steps down, into the dark. The further we descended, the colder it got, like the temperature was being sucked out of the air itself. The walls around us were damp and peeling, and the smell, musty, thick with decay, hit us like a wall. It smelled like the place had been left to rot in some forgotten corner of the city, a time capsule no one wanted to open. Dust coated everything, blanketing the old tracks that stretched into the darkness, swallowing our flashlight beams. Once we reached the platform, we were struck by how untouched everything looked. There were still old advertisements plastered along the walls, barely visible, but there. They looked like they were from another era, selling products no one remembered anymore. It was unsettling, seeing those faded smiles, the slogans almost whispers in the thick, stale air. "Let's go further," someone suggested, and, despite the gnawing unease in my gut, I agreed. After all, this was the dare, the thrill we'd come for. We walked deeper, our footsteps echoing down the empty station. We joked, laughing a bit too loudly to shake off the tension that seemed to cling to us, like the chill in the air. Then, Emily froze. She was just a step or two ahead, and I remember how she suddenly stopped, her face going pale. She let out a gasp, looking down at her arm, her voice shaky when she spoke. Did someone just grab me?" We all turned to look, a few nervous laughs breaking out. But she wasn't laughing. She kept looking around, her eyes wide, like she expected to see someone, something that we couldn't. I was right there, and I swear there was no one else in that station but us. I tried to joke it off, but her expression was enough to kill the laughter. That's when I first felt it, too. The sense that we weren't alone. It felt like someone was watching, lurking just out of sight. As we stood there, we started to hear it. The whispers, faint at first, like the echo of voices just on the edge of hearing. We couldn't tell where they were coming from, but they seemed to echo all around us, bouncing off the walls, filling the space. We strained to listen, and as we did, the whispers grew louder, words starting to take shape. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, pleading, moaning, almost crying. The air seemed to grow heavier, colder, as if those voices were draining the warmth from our bodies, our breath fogging up in the frigid air. We exchanged glances, nerves fraying, our confidence starting to crack. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed, tapping it, hoping it wouldn't die on me. But the darkness seemed thicker, swallowing the light faster than I could shine it. Someone suggested it was time to go. The idea couldn't have come soon enough. We turned back, retracing our steps, relief almost tangible as we neared the exit. But as we reached the place where we'd forced open the boards, something was wrong. The exit was gone. Where the boarded-up doorway had been, there was nothing but a solid wall. We stared, disbelieving, my heart hammering in my chest as I reached out, feeling the cold, hard surface where the opening should have been. The wood, the boards, the gap we'd pried open. They had all vanished. Someone yelled, a desperate, panicked sound that cut through the silence. But the walls swallowed it, muffling it until it felt like nothing more than a whisper in the dark. I felt the panic start to claw at my throat, a wild, primal fear that made my skin crawl. The whispers had started again, but this time they weren't faint. They were louder, clearer, surrounding us, closing in. We could hear them calling our names, one by one, voices laced with despair, pleading, begging us to help them. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly, the beam barely cutting through the dark now, like the shadows themselves were alive, fighting to snuff out the light. Someone tried to pound on the wall, another shouted for help, but every sound we made seemed to get sucked into the void, swallowed up before it could reach anywhere. There was no response, no indication that anyone could hear us, and then the whispers turned into screams, blood-curdling, anguished screams that echoed off the walls, ricocheting around us, filling every corner of the station. I covered my ears, trying to block them out, but they pierced through, relentless, relentless. In the dim glow of our flashlights, we could barely make each other out, our faces pale, terror etched into every line. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst, my breaths coming in short, desperate gasps as I struggled to hold it together. But in that moment, I knew we were trapped by whatever lived in the shadows of that place, the lost souls, the remnants of people long forgotten. I don't know how long we stayed there, huddled together, backs against the cold wall, our eyes darting into the dark, expecting something, anything to come for us. Time lost all meaning in that endless, suffocating darkness. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the screams stopped. The whispers faded. Silence descended, thick and heavy. I don't know what finally snapped me out of it, what made me push myself off that wall, force my legs to move. But somehow I started walking, dragging my friends with me, leading them back toward the platform, the only landmark we knew. The air was still cold, still thick with that smell of decay, but there was a strange stillness now, a heaviness in the silence. And then we saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance. With no other choice, we stumbled toward it, our footsteps echoing in the empty station. The light grew brighter, guiding us forward until, finally, we saw it. The entrance. The boards were back, the gap we'd pried open waiting like it had never vanished at all. We scrambled out, gasping for air as we stumbled into the night, collapsing on the cold pavement. We didn't speak. We just lay there, shaking, each of us grappling with what we had just endured, what we'd barely escaped. We don't talk about that night anymore. We try to pretend it never happened. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear those whispers again, faint and distant, like a memory clawing its way back from the dark. And I know, deep down, that part of us is still down there, trapped in that forgotten station, just waiting for someone else to take the dare.